Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fourth in our series of events in this academic year for the Russian Cinema Research Group. I'm Phil Cavendish, and I do not have a visual image of myself, which is extremely embarrassing, but I am going to be hosting this meeting. There is a technical problem. For some reason, my video is not starting, so I hope you'll bear with me and not be too put off by the fact that you can't actually see me. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Yuri Shevchuk this evening to come and to give his talk. Before I introduce him more fully, there are just one or two things I want to say in advance. The first thing to say is that Rachel and I co-authored a letter at the end of last week, which we sent out to all the members of the Russian Cinema Research Group, which explains the rationale for organising this event taking place this evening, and also an event that is going to take place on the 30th of May involving Olga Bruchavetska. Now, many of you will have hopefully read that letter, but not everybody who is here this evening is a member of the Russian Cinema Research Group. So I'm just going to briefly, if I may, summarize the main points of that letter, because it explains why we're dedicating the next two events to the history of Ukrainian cinema, but it's also why we're going to be planning in the foreseeable future a series of events that are going to be dedicated to Ukrainian cinema. So the first reason for this evening's event is to celebrate 100 years since the establishment of the cinematic body that was called VUFCU, which is All Ukrainian Photos Cinema Administration, which was created on the 13th of March 1922, and was an enormously important organization in the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, although it was brought to an end in 1930. It was an enormously important institution in terms of fostering and developing a distinctive Ukrainian cinema during the 1920s. And many of the most brilliant names of Soviet cinema and Soviet Ukrainian cinema are associated with that institution. The second reason, and perhaps more importantly, we wanted to send a message or gesture of support for all Ukrainians who are currently suffering the most atrocious and barbaric invasion on the part of the Russian military. I'm sure you join in me in condemning this unambiguously. It is an absolutely atrocious event, which has not only led to countless deaths and abuses, human rights abuses, violations, sexual violations, material destruction, bombings, deliberate bombings of monuments of Ukrainian national culture, plus theft. This deserves to be condemned absolutely unambiguously on behalf of, by everybody in the Slavic world, and in particular by Russia specialists. And we wanted to send a gesture of solidarity to the Ukrainian people. The third rationale is of course linked to this event, and that is the short-term impact in terms of boycotting all Russian institutions, including Russian film institutions, and Russian filmmakers, in other words, filmmakers from the Russian Federation. This boycott has been called for in Ukraine and is currently being envisaged as a provisional measure for the duration of the war, although its long-term impact may be more widespread than that. It remains to be seen. A more longer term, or at least medium term, ramification of this war is undoubtedly a reconceptualization, a revisiting of the history of Russian cinema, Soviet cinema, Soviet Russian and Soviet Ukrainian cinema, in order to draw attention to the perpetuation of racist and imperial stereotypes in that cinema at various different stages in its history, and also to draw attention to the realities of Russian linguistic and cultural appropriation. Obviously, that is a phenomenon with a very long history in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, or the Russian peoples and the Ukrainian peoples. It has a particular ramification in relation to pre-revolutionary cinema, Soviet cinema and post-Soviet cinema, both in the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And there will be debates, and there are debates taking place about, or certainly on the part of people who are interested in Russian and Ukrainian cinema, about whether we have done enough in the past to draw attention to the distinctiveness of Ukrainian cinema, and what can be done to remedy that, both in terms of the focus of our research, but also in terms of what we teach, the way that we teach, and so on and so forth. So the first event that we wanted to organize was the event that we're having tonight. We've invited Yuri Shevchuk to come and talk to us. The title of his talk is Cinematic Depopulation as a Variety of Cultural Imperialism. Yuri is a lecturer of Ukraine at Columbia University. He holds a PhD in shamanic philology from Kiev State University and an MA in political science from the New School of Social Research. He teaches courses in Ukrainian, Soviet and post-Soviet film. He's written and lectured on issues related to Ukrainian language, identity, culture, and cinema. In 2004, he founded the Ukrainian Film Club at Columbia University, the only permanent forum for Ukrainian film in North America. So it's with great pleasure that we invite him to talk this evening. Just a few housekeeping issues. Many of you will be familiar with these. The first is we would request you to keep your microphones off during the course of Yuri's presentation this evening. There will be an opportunity to take questions at the end of his talk. You can either wait until the end of the talk before putting your hand up and putting your question in person, or you can put questions in the chat as the presentation continues, and I will either read those questions out when the presentation has come to an end, or I will invite you to read your own question. We're envisaging around 45 to 60 minutes for the presentation and around 20 to 30 minutes for the question and after session and question and answer session and any discussions that might emerge as a result of that. But anyway, Yuri, with great pleasure, I hand over to you. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Philip, for organizing this seminar. Philip and Rachel, thank you very much for inviting me with this presentation. I would like to dedicate my talk today to the people of Ukraine who are fighting unprovoked and illegal and brutal Russian aggression against the independent Ukraine. My presentation is based on part of a larger research project that I started a long time ago, and it pertained to the use of language or languages in Soviet and post-Soviet film, and it led me to studying how one specific mode of presentation of Ukraine and Ukrainians on the silver screen, both in the Soviet period and since the collapse of the Soviet Union, in Ukrainian and Russian film. So let's see if our technology works. Now there's a bit of a, I don't know what happens. Okay. So a bit of a historical context before I address the issue at hand. Ukrainians in literature and in both in Russian imperial imagination and Ukrainian self-view as greatly and deeply influenced by Russian imperial narratives, traditionally were regarded as mostly rural, back-looking, and ethnographic culture that is antithetical to modernity and the city. Ukrainian literary characters mostly populated the village, and very rarely the urban space. And there was a long-standing populist tradition of Ukrainian literature that is exemplified by such leading figures as Ivan Kotlяревsky, Kvitka Osnovyanenko, and on and on and on. Irena Makarik, who studied Ukrainian theater in the 1920s and 30s, interestingly analyzed the limitations imposed on Ukrainian theater in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the Russian censorship that were designed to strengthen this association of Ukrainian identity with the village, with folklore and museum. And this association has in fact persisted in the Ukrainian consciousness until quite recently. On one occasion, I lectured to young Ukrainian filmmakers at the Ivan Karpenko-Kary University for Film, Theater and Television, and asked them, what do you think it means to be a Ukrainian? And they started describing to me people in embroidered shirts and sharovari and all this kind of the rest of it. And that was literally 10 years ago. But with the start of the first Ukrainian liberation struggle, marked by the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, February Revolution followed by October coup, new topoi appeared in the Ukrainian national narrative. And the discovery of the city, the world, and modernity in Ukrainian literature, theater, film, arts, and architecture. And this discovery was led by Saokhin, is associated with such towering figures in Ukrainian literature and cultures, Khviliovy, Valerian Podmohylny, Yuri Yanovsky, and a number of others. The same discovery on the expansion of the Ukrainian narrative into new spaces can be attributed to Ukrainian filmmaking. So Ukraine's cinematic geography rapidly expands to include the city and the world. The Ukrainians suddenly find themselves living, inhabiting the city, but also acting and having their stories evolving in the outer world, abroad even. So and this is kind of in parallel with this, there appear new film genres in early Ukrainian filmmaking in the 1920s. They include the detective, comedy, political thriller, psychological drama, industrial drama, and of course, documentary films. You see some of the examples of that in my slide. So Ukrainian, most importantly, the language becomes the language of filmmaking. And it does so even in the period of silent filmmaking. The intertitles start being produced in Ukrainian, but the first ever made Ukrainian talking film, which is Alexander Dovzhenko's Ivan, 1932, of course, Dzihavertov's The Symphony of Donbass is traditionally considered to be the first talking film made in Ukraine, but there's no talking there. There's only noises and industrial, the symphony of industrial music, so to speak. But the first film when we actually hear Ukrainian actors speak is Alexander Dovzhenko's Ivan, made in 1932. And Ivan effects something, or Dovzhenko in Ivan effects something truly revolutionary. It makes the language that up until recently had been considered only a peasant language, the language of this very modern, very fashionable, incredibly attractive medium of human self-expression, which was cinema. That was truly revolutionary. Ukrainian starts being associated with filmmaking, shattering this provincial image of Ukrainian culture and making Ukrainian culture increasingly modern sounding and modern looking. So Dovzhenko, in fact, decolonizes Ukraine on the silver screen in so many aspects, not only linguistically speaking. He creates this new link between the Ukrainian language and revolution and industrialization and social progress and the notion of future itself. Dovzhenko makes Ukrainian the language of all society, not only peasants speaking in the countryside, but most importantly of workers, of students, of university professors, and very top government and party functionaries. That is again something revolutionary. Dovzhenko presents Ukrainian identity and culture as independent of Russian and self-sufficient. We don't see Russians in Dovzhenko's trilogy, and we don't see them in Ivan. Maybe with some little or a few exceptions, notable ones. Dovzhenko associates Russian, and this is absolutely unheard of, with bourgeois narrow-mindedness and social reaction. And Dovzhenko, when he starts working on Ivan, he is pressured into shooting the film in Russian. And he comes up with this absolutely fake story that is documented in the book by George Lieber about Dovzhenko, when Dovzhenko claims that, oh, he would love to make it in Russian, but he can't find actors, Ukrainian actors in Ukraine who speak decent Russian. And this is really laughable because when you listen to Ivan's, many actors speak Ukrainian with Russian inflection, kind of signifying that their first lesson is Russian. But to Dovzhenko, making his first talking film in Ukrainian was so very important that he not only concocted that story, but literally risked his life. The film was made in 1932 on the eve of the Holodomor, but already the Holodomor started already in 1929 with the show trial of the Spilka Vyzvolenia Ukrainy, the Ukraine liberation movement that marked the destruction of Ukrainian cultural elite. And Dovzhenko literally risked his life insisting on being what would be labeled in similar situation as Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism. Let's listen to this dialogue where Ukrainian stands for progress and proliferation of technology in industrializing socialist Ukraine, and Russian is spoken by this woman who likes things foreign and looks at radio and revolution as something hostile. Let's hope you can hear it, or at least read the slightly imperfect translation.
Просто невозможно. В каждом городишке кожному селі збудуємо. Не світо стопуємо. Я не замовчите ви. Сало 15 масло 15. Міщан.
So Dovzhenko does many other revolutionary things that are deeply subversive of the official imperial communist ideology. Instead of counterposing the national to the class in identities, he synthesizes both of them in his film trilogy, Zveni Hora, Arsenal, and Earth, particularly in Arsenal, where his character Timis, you can see him on the upper photo, starts or responds with when he's questioned by a recruiter who you are, he says, asking him, "Are you Ukrainian?" And he is enraged and says, "I am a worker." And towards the end of the film, when he fights the counter-revolutionary Central Rada, he is being shot at. He runs out of his rounds. He stands up in desperation, rips open his coat, exposes his chest, and says, "I am a Ukrainian worker." Thus, in one sentence, synthesizing something that at that time was irreconcilably considered to be irreconcilably hostile: Ukrainianness, ethnicity, and class characteristic, and thus making Ukrainian identity truly indestructible, something that would that cannot be taken apart. This is something of the context against which we are going to be talking about the specific mode of representation of Ukraine and Ukrainians that emerges in the Soviet film in the mid-1930s. So what do I mean by cinematic depopulation? The cinematic depopulation is a specific strategy of the discursive appropriation of the colony by the colonizer when the cinematic topography or the ethnoscape of a given nation is separated from its national community on the silver screen and populated by the colonizer and presented to the viewer as the colonizer's own historical territory. As a kind of a conceptual framework for this analysis, I would like to quickly outline Raphael Lemkin's description of the Holodomor, because I use it as a conceptual framework for the interaction of Ukrainian and Russian culture and the aggression of Russian culture against Ukrainian culture. So the Ukrainian genocide of the late 1920s and early 1930s, otherwise known as the Holodomor, served as a case study for Raphael Lemkin, whose writings became basis for the United Nations definition of genocide. And so he writes about a four-pronged attack against the Ukrainian civilization and culture orchestrated by Moscow, by Kremlin. The first blow is a blow to the head of the nation, which was the destruction of Ukraine's political and cultural elites. It started with the trial of the Ukrainian Liberation Union in 1929. The second blow to the heart of the nation, the destruction of Ukraine's religious organization, self-organization, and in particular the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church. Thirdly, a blow to the body of the nation, that is the killing by hunger of more than 4 million Ukrainian peasants that were principal carriers of Ukrainian identity. And fourth, and which is important for our analysis, a mass resettlement of Russians to the ethnically cleansed Ukrainian territories. And this analysis, this particular fourth point, very much renders itself to what I'm about to say about the cinematographic depopulation of Ukraine, because it almost mimics what happened in physical terms. The cleansing, physical destruction of Ukrainians on physical territory was echoed or paralleled and continued to be used as a mode of representation of Ukrainians on screen. It wasn't physical, but it was cinematographic. So since the mid-1930s, Ukrainian cities and even the countryside were gradually cleansed of Ukrainians and are settled with Russian characters. Ukraine on the silver screen was becoming a territory that was kind of strange, increasingly alien to Ukrainians. Anthony Smith, in his text, Images of the Nation, Cinema, Art, and National Identity, dwells on the importance of what he calls ethnoscape for a national cinema, for any national cinema. And he writes, I quote, the nation's territory mirrors the ethnic community and is historicized by the communal events and processes whose relics and monuments dot its landscape, so that the land comes to belong to a people in the same way as the people belong to a particular land, creating an ancestral homeland, end quote. So the connectedness of the Ukrainian people to their ancestral land is a central topos in early Ukrainian, Soviet Ukrainian cinema. And in Dovzhenko's Zvenigora, Arsenal and Earth, by Earth, and also in Ivan, this connectedness is their central philosophical idea. The end of indigenization brought about new forms of Russification and the shrinking of the Ukrainian cinematic geography, dramatic shrinking. Again, the city increasingly becomes an alien territory to Ukrainian filmmakers. And this is kind of in sync. This tendency evolves simultaneously with the kind of disappearance of the new genres of filmmaking, like psychological drama, industrial drama, and urban drama. Joshua First, in his book, which I like very much, entitled Ukrainian Cinema, Belonging and Identity During the Soviet Thaw, argues that from 1934 and on, the so-called folkloric mode of representation of the nation became dominant in Soviet Ukrainian film. Under, I quote, under a Stalinist mode of national representation, the landscapes and peoples of the Soviet periphery achieved recognition as unique within a folkloric visual vocabulary, replete with costumes, dancing peasants, and other evidence of national color, end quote. During the period of the thaw, the folkloric mode is supplemented by the ethnographic mode of representing Ukrainians. Again, a quote from Joshua First. It highlighted visual style and circular narration, where human subject exists within the landscape, unable to stand apart from it. So it's the landscape, yet again, not the cityscape. So First also writes about the dramatic and progressive shrinking of Ukraine that you see on the screen to a very small part of it that is the Carpathian Mountains. I would like to argue that there was a third mode of cinematic representation of Ukraine, namely the cinematic depopulation of Ukraine. The cinematic depopulation has been widely used in Soviet and post-Soviet Ukrainian and Russian films. Russian culture, to understand how it was used, I would like to draw a parallel between film and literature and kind of invoke the work of American literary scholar Eva Thompson. Russian culture, as she eloquently writes in her book, the Russian culture, it's called Imperial Knowledge, Russian Culture and Colonialism, that Russian culture appears as an apologist and facilitator of Russian imperial expansion. Russian writers presented imperial land grabs as a natural process of expansion, beneficial for indigenous peoples, and the captured territories as devoid of the indigenous population. The colonized either disappears without a trace or has no culture, language, or voice. The Russian colonizer speaks for and about the colonized. So a quote from Eva Thompson, in the Russian case, which is important, this quote for what I'm about to say about film. In the Russian case, territorial conquests were followed by incorporation into Russia or imposition of government subservient to Russian interests. Russian literature mediated this process by imposing on the conquered territories a narrative of Russian presence that elbowed out native concerns and the native story. Russian writers abetted the power of the center so as to prevent the periphery from speaking in its own voice and conveying its own experience as a narrative subject, rather than an attachment to the center, end quote. So in the works of Russian writers, the indigenous nations are erased. And if they do appear, then only as such they are on the threshold of Russification. This expression, on the threshold of Russification, is very much pertinent to how Ukrainians appear in Soviet and post-Soviet film. So presenting Ukraine as devoid of its indigenous population, Soviet cinema thus does not so much describe Ukraine as ascribes it fictitious Russianness. Ukraine, its cities, and even villages are presented on screen without Ukrainians. Instead, the viewer sees Russians or Russified Ukrainians in national garb, often as caricatures. The depopulation of colonies is a representational mode that is highly typical of Soviet cinema. There are two varieties, I argue, of such representational mode. One is, call it light depopulation or partial depopulation, where Ukraine and Ukrainians are reduced on the screen to a caricature, a distortion, a fake, a racist stereotype along the lines of the singing and dancing tribe, a description of Ukrainians or Little Russians attributed to Catherine II. The second variety of this is the most extreme, complete depopulation, when Ukraine is presented as a land that is completely devoid of its indigenous people and occupied by Russians. Early examples that show this strategy of depopulating Ukraine are the so-called Ukrainian Cohorts cycle of films made by Ivan Pyryev, an incredibly influential Soviet Russian film director. And I mean, primarily his comedies, A Rich Bride, made in 1937, and Tractor Drivers, 1939. And then with 10-year kind of interval, the Cuban Cossacks or Kuban Cossacks, made in 1949. Both these early two films unfold in the Ukrainian countryside, and so are the Kuban Cossacks, even though Kuban is ethnically Ukrainian at that time. So the Ukrainians in both are purely decorative. They sport Ukrainian names that are, however, pronounced the Russian way: Marinka Lukash, Pavlo Zgara, Mariana Bazhan, Klim Yarko, Nazar Duma, and so on. But the fact that Ukrainian first names do not get Russified, in fact, clashes with the tradition of Russifying Ukrainian names. So that way they are designed to signal that these characters are Ukrainian, but they are Ukrainian only superficially. These characters wear Ukrainian embroidered shirts. They are colonial stereotypes of Little Russians, people that in essence do not differ from Great Russians. They are Russians paid to pretend they are Ukrainians. They are the Soviet equivalent of the blackface. Ukrainian characters appear in such films really as caricatures, and it's sometimes challenging to read them this way because we're talking about comedy. And so in comedy, people are supposed to be funny, but Ukrainians are funny not because they do certain funny things, which is also true, but very often simply because being Ukrainian is by default funny. And this kind of meme, a colonial meme, was deconstructed and was kind of attacked by Ukrainian playwright who was killed by the Soviets, Mykola Kulish, in his immortal and genius play called Mina Mazaylo, the famous phrase, are you serious or are you being Ukrainian? Ви серйозно чи по-українському? That exactly is what he implied, that in the Russian imperial mentality, being Ukrainian is automatically means being funny. So these characters speak Russian that is peppered with an occasional Ukrainianism, дівчина, хлопець, батька, гарний, треба, здоровенькі були. They are all kind of obligatory signifiers of this decorative Ukrainianness or Ukrainian identity, or a Russian, a racist fabrication thereof, because there's nothing behind that, nothing essentially Ukrainian behind that facade. These Ukrainianisms, however, do not hamper general comprehensibility of the speech of the characters, but such Ukrainian characters would always have recognizably Ukrainian family names and even first names. The non-Ukrainian viewer hearing and seeing such characters constructed in such a way forms the impression, the opinion that Ukrainian language is in fact an uneducated, impoverished, and often funny variety of Russian. And these often funny cinematic Ukrainians are in fact Russians, quite in line with the imperial myth of the triune Russian people, триединый русский народ. Ukrainian viewers, however, would perceive such filmic Ukrainians as crude caricatures they could not and would not identify with. The impression that Ukrainians are a fake identity is enhanced by the fact that such Ukrainian characters are played by some of the most iconic Russian film stars. It would, in other situations, such a casting decision would clash with the intention. It's like casting Brigitte Bardot in the role of, I don't know, of some German character, or that, but not in this particular case. Such replacement of Ukrainians with Russians, pretending to be Ukrainians, caused, and until today, has caused no cognitive dissonance in the Soviet viewers or film critics. Now, the complete depopulation, where Ukraine appears on the screen completely devoid of Ukrainians. This extreme variety of depopulation occurs when Ukraine appears in film without Ukrainians anywhere in sight. And a good example in my mind of such a strategy is the film by Alexander Askoldov, the war drama called Commissar, which I like so very much. So in the film, the action takes place in the Ukrainian village of Berdychi, which is located in central Ukraine. But in the film, it's inhabited only by the Red Army soldiers and local Jews. Ukrainians are nowhere in sight. They are spoken about by others. They are reduced to one stereotype of one Ataman Struk, a bloodthirsty bandit leader. His only distinction is the fact that he murders the brother of the poor local Jewish craftsman Magazinnik. So in Commissar, Ukrainians are allowed to exist in their own homeland only in the words of others, in order to create the background against which Jews appear as helpless victims and Russian occupiers as their liberators and defenders. Thus depopulated, Ukraine appears in Commissar as a no man's land, a trophy that needs to be taken possession of. It is portrayed as a land dominated by lawlessness and chaos, in dire need of order that the colonizer can bring. A Russian soldier, not unexpectedly, and quite in sync with such a view, says, quote, "Ukraine will be ours. Sooner or later, she will be ours." Depopulation as a cinematographic representational mode of Ukraine is very widely used in Soviet and post-Soviet film. These are just a couple of examples of very influential films, the films that were very popular, that were beloved by Soviet viewers, including this one, and that formed the perception and self-vision of Ukrainians at that time. And this list is far from being exhaustive. But these films all implanted in the minds of the Soviet viewers the idea that Ukraine is quite conceivable without Ukrainians in it. In post-Soviet times, one of the most active practitioner of the cinematic depopulation of Ukraine was Kira Muratova. She consistently uses this mode in her entire body of films. With a few exceptions, her films unfold in Odessa, which is a southern Ukrainian port, but her characters are Russian or little Russians on the threshold of Russification. By their narratives, senses, cultural content, language, Muratova's films are Russian stories taking place in Ukraine, represented as a Russian ethnoscape. Muratova invites the iconic Russian actors Oleg Tabakov, Alla Demidova, Renata Litvinova, Nina Ruslanova, and others to play the lead roles in her films. Even Ukrainian actors such as Natalia Buzko, Georgy Deliev, Uta Kilter, and the most iconic Ukrainian actor, whom many consider to be the epitome of Ukrainian national identity, Bogdan Stupka, they speak all Russian in her films and therefore come across and are perceived as Russian. Cinematic depopulation of Ukraine as the representational mode in post-Soviet film explains or helps us understand the persistence and longevity in the mind of millions of Ukrainians, but also of Russians, of the imperial myth about the fact that Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, and other Ukrainian cities are, quote, naturally Russian speaking. Because this idea of them being naturally Russian speaking was amplified and enhanced by the entire body of films where Ukraine was presented as devoid of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainians in any meaningful sense of this word. A large body of movies and television series have been made over the period of independence where the action takes place in Ukraine, cleansed of Ukrainians, visual cues of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian adverts, street names, signs of institutions, license plates, and other elements of the linguistic landscape, indispensable for any other independent country as opposed to a colony. And the objective reality, the reality on the ground, clashes with this fictional or fictitious, fabricated cinematographic reality. Because if you look at the last full Ukrainian census of 2001, almost 68% of citizens of Ukraine declared Ukrainian to be their mother tongue, and 29% Russian. And that tendency of increasing percentage of Ukrainian speakers is becoming more and more pronounced. If we look at the provinces of Odessa, Kharkiv, and Kiev itself, yet again, Ukrainian, even by this statistic, is not negligible. It's almost half. In Odessa, it's almost half. In Kharkiv, it's more than half. And in Kiev, it is as much as 71%. But that's not the impression you get when you see these cities on screen, both on Soviet screen and on post-Soviet screen. For instance, if you look at the film, at the beloved classic, Soviet classic, Vesna na Zarechной uliце, which was all filmed in Zaporizhia, Ukraine, there's everything that is left of Ukraine in the film is Ukrainian family names. And most notably, there's a scene, a very interesting scene of a roll call when the teacher of Russian literature calls students in her class. And one Ukrainian family name sounds like Ishachenko, like donkey man. That's the racist reduction, the ultimate racist reduction of Ukrainian culture to an animal, a donkey, an idiot. That to me was very, very emblematic of this strategy. Depopulation is widely used in not only in films made for the silver screen, but also in television series. And the television series for a very long time, up until quite recently, we're talking 2, 3, 4 years ago, were made not with Ukrainian viewer in mind, but with the so-called the viewer of the Commonwealth of Independent States. And so to make it the films palatable to that viewer, and that was explained to me by the filmmakers themselves, all the visual and audio or other cues sending the viewer, reminding the viewer that the action takes place in Ukraine, were removed from the screen and replaced by Russian ones. So some of the most or more notorious examples of television series that use the strategy of cinematic depopulation are the last Muscovite or Ostatny Moskal, produced by Alexander Tkachenko, who is currently the Minister of Culture of Ukraine. Of course, the Svaty, and most notably Servant of the People, produced by the production company run alongside everybody else by the would-be president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. So Servant of the People, the series, is a particularly typical example of this, of how this mode of representation was used in post-Soviet Ukrainian television content production. Ukraine is presented in the series as discursively occupied by Russia. It is populated by Russians. All principal characters speak Russian, behave and think like Russians, and invoke Russian symbols, values, allusions to Russian literature, and etc. Russian characters dominate the government, education, business, and city streets. There are no Ukrainians in essential sense of the word, not as caricatures. An occasional actor pretends to be a Ukrainian, while most, including the protagonist by the name of Holodomor, who is elected president of Ukraine, do not even bother to pretend they are Ukrainian. As the president of Ukraine in the film, the protagonist is required in one particular situation to read his speech in Ukrainian. And visibly frustrated, he says in Russian, "No, I'll stay who I am and will speak Russian." So the Ukrainian language is really a decoration in the series to mitigate the hegemony of the Russian language, Russian senses, Russian values, and Russian culture. An occasional extra will utter an occasional word, phrase, or even sentence in Ukrainian as if to signify a Ukrainian on the verge of complete crucifixion, a Ukrainian alien and hostile to things Ukrainian. Other extras are crude racist caricatures of Ukrainians. Racism in this series, as in most TV content produced by the studio Kvartal 95, parades as comedy. I think I said enough and hopefully provoked enough questions. As a conclusion, I'd like to say that the representational mode of cinematic depopulation of Ukraine is a strategy of appropriation and colonization of its territory by the Imperial Russian culture. And the Ukrainians actively participated in this strategy themselves. It aims at implanting into the viewer's consciousness the idea that Ukraine is quite thinkable without Ukrainians, without their culture and language. It presents the discursive occupation of Ukraine by Russia as the norm. Imagine Paris, where all characters speak German. Or imagine Athens, where all characters speak Turkish. Or imagine New Delhi, where all characters speak Mandarin. That would probably be imaginable in some kind of a dystopian horror story. But in Ukrainian case, it's the norm. And unlike these films, such films would probably provoke a scandal in Paris, in New Delhi, and in Athens. They have not done so or provoke any kind of a rejection or opprobrium on the part of society in Ukrainian case. So the cinematic depopulation has been and continues to be a variety of hybrid aggression and information war and neocolonialism meant to conquer Ukraine by cinematic and discursive means, and in doing so prepare its physical occupation, its recolonization. The cinematographic depopulation taught generations of Soviet and post-Soviet Ukrainians to accept and internalize the imperial myth that Ukrainian urban space is, quote, naturally Russian-speaking, end quote. Cinematographic depopulation prepared, in some very important sense, the current Russian aggression against independent Ukraine. Thank you. And you already know that if you would like to read more on this, my article in Ukrainian was just published as part of this book. And thank you for circulating the information about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuri. That was incredibly stimulating and very, very educational. It raises an enormous number of questions, it seems to me, and I'm not sure that we will be able to respond to all the things that you've raised in your talk. We have one question in the chat at the moment, which is from Rashid Chowdhury. Rashid, do you want to read this question out yourself, or are you happy for me to read it? Okay, I'll read the question then. as you can see, you've given the population statistics for Odessa province, but surely you know the situation in the city of Odessa itself is different. According to the 2001 census, 65% of the population of the city of Odessa declared Russian to be their native language, and only 30% are native Ukrainian speakers. Even a brief visit to Odessa would confirm this. That seems quite a specific question, bearing in mind the framework of your talk. But would you like to comment on that?
Oh, absolutely, and it's an excellent question. Thank you, Rashid, for questions that would that I anticipated, and many people would pose. The question goes to whether the film or the filmmaking should be a strict reflection of reality, or they should create a reality of their own. And if we are to espouse the first, the former, we would expect films to be a bit like documentaries. Dovzhenko apparently was in favor of the latter vision of film as being a medium that creates its own reality. Dovzhenko created his film Ivan, where Ukrainian is the language of the entire Ukrainian nation. I can assure you that that vision clashed with the reality on the ground. Ukrainian cities were heavily Russified, where Ukrainian universities were heavily Russified. The party apparatus was heavily Russified. That did not keep Dovzhenko from portraying Ukraine as completely Ukrainian speaking. And guess what? Nobody protested, at least to the best of my knowledge. Nobody accused Dovzhenko of being not true to reality, because film creates its own reality. And that's the definition of film as a truly high art. And I am inclined, even if you take the kinds of the road of saying, okay, nobody or 2/3 of people in Odessa speak Russian, therefore all films about Odessa should be Russian speaking, I would politely disagree with that kind of with that kind of a philosophy, because that philosophy kind of negates the very nature of filmmaking as something that creates a reality of its own and a logic of its own. And the logic of colonialism is using the power of the film to create the reality that serves colonialist teleology, the teleology of destroying the Ukrainians as a civilization. Ukrainian national cinema has a different teleology, asserting Ukrainian nation, affecting its decolonization, and creating the project that is the project of Ukrainian independence. So I don't think this argument really stands the chance of serious scrutiny. Also, I'm inclined in favor of art in Nietzschean understanding, art being a mirror that does not only reflect, but transforms reality. I don't know if I answered that question.
Yes, I think you answered it admirably. I have, and thank you very much. I have a question from Birgit.
Oh, Birgit.
Sorry, who needs to? Hello,
Hi,
nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
who has 2 buttons to switch and 2 questions to ask. Yuri, thank you very much for your presentation, which was really, really stimulating and interesting. And I have 2 questions. One that takes me 2 questions. One that takes me a little bit out of Ukraine, and I want to ask to what extent we can compare the situation in Ukraine, both historically and today, with other former Soviet republics, say, for example, in Central Asia, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in. And secondly, when we talk about film, to what extent might we also want to focus on the aspect of creating a film language where it is not so much the spoken word and the language that the filmmaker uses, but the visual side. And I'm thinking here in particular, I guess, of Kira Muratova, where you say quite rightly so that, you know, she uses Russian language. To what extent does the language factor alone make her fit into a category where we might question her allegiance to cinematic traditions? I guess that's the question I want to get at.
I have a very short, thank you, Birgit. I have a very short answer to the first question. I don't feel I am in a position to compare with other post-Soviet or Soviet colonies, because I don't know enough I can say that I would expect that this kind of strategy is used in representation of other. I'm trying to think of Georgian film or some Belarusian films. So I will reserve or keep this question open for fear of saying something that is not there really. As to Kira Muratova, I like Kira Muratova very much. I absolutely luxuriate watching her films. They are they have their own language, filmic language, but and they have their own verbal language, which is Russian. Ukrainian is really on the margins. She uses Ukrainian language in a peculiar way. I write about it a little bit longer in the article that's published. We can't interpret Kira Muratova taking her out of the colonial context of Ukraine, and like say that, okay, she shows the Odessa that she knows, she is familiar with, and she takes interest in, and whatever is of no interest to her, she doesn't show. But in a way, she is a genius who shows the very Russian, very colonialist Russian vision of Ukrainian identity as completely invisible in Odessa. And, you know, I've been to Odessa so many times, and I speak Ukrainian there, and you'd be surprised, every probably 4th person responds in Ukrainian to me. But it takes courage to speak Ukrainian in Odessa, because you would provoke aggression, some kind of a joke, some kind of verbal aggression, not physical. So not everybody is strong enough to speak Ukrainian. But what I mean to say by this, that Ukrainians are reduced to invisibility in Odessa, both by the symbolic violence that has been the place in the so-called Russified parts of Ukraine, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro now, Donetsk, Luhansk, and so on. But they are also reduced to invisibility in films. So the Soviet films make something, do to Ukrainians something quite opposite to what Dovzhenko did to them. Dovzhenko blew Ukrainianness and Ukrainian identity out of proportions and made it like larger than life, dominant in his films. Quite contrary, as I said, to what the place it really occupied in real life. Kira Muratova does the opposite, even though she considers Dovzhenko to be influential or important for her own creativity, for her own body work. She just reduces them to non-existence. That's also cinematographic language in a way. How she does it, and how, I'm so sorry, I never got to interrogate her, to speak with her about that. I had 2 conversations with her over the phone. The first one was when I called her on the occasion of her retrospective at the Lincoln Center Film Society. And she immediately interrupted me and said, I don't speak Ukrainian. I said, I will speak Russian then. So in a way, she wasn't very kind of inclined or amicable towards Ukrainian, or at least that's the impression that I got from my first conversation with her. I know I didn't answer your first and second question.
It does. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Julian, you absolutely can ask a question. Yes, please go ahead.
So it was fascinating listening to you. You didn't mention Parajanov's Shadows, and I wonder what you think about that film, which clearly was made in a Ukrainian studio, tried very hard to sort of capture Ukrainian culture, although obviously with a huge personal input into it. As I think I know, at the time was kind of admired by Ukrainians as having sort of tried to engage with their culture. And yet it's fake, isn't it? So I wonder what you think about someone who tries really hard to be Ukrainian, who isn't Ukrainian, tries to be really hard to be Ukrainian in their filmmaking. And just following on from what you're saying about Muratova, which of course was shocking to somebody like me, and I'm sure to other people listening. I mean, Muratova clearly took a pro-Ukrainian position in her life after 2014, for example. So that leads me to a question about language. I mean, Irish people make all their films in English and speak in English, but it doesn't make them feel colonized. Is it really not possible to be Russian linguistically, Russian speaking, and yet to feel very Ukrainian in the way that lots and lots of people are saying now? So those are 2 very different questions. The first one about Parajan, the second one was just provoked from what you've been saying about Muratova. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for very interesting questions. I didn't mention Parajanov because he actually stands opposite from this cinematic strategy of depopulating Ukraine. He creates a vision of Ukrainian identity that is strangely, that is fake, but strangely convincing, and reinforcing Ukrainian linguistic identity by deploying the language which is deeply authentic, combined with song culture, which is deeply authentic, combined with other elements of Ukrainian visual culture, the costume and whatnot, that in a way work contrary to the expected, because Georgians are playing Ukrainians, and it's obvious that the Molfar is not a Ukrainian by any stretch of imagination. But the Ukrainian viewer forgets about this completely, and goes along with this fabrication, and comes away from the film incredibly edified and proud of being Ukrainian, of representing the culture that is so rich and so going to addressing the universal human conundra and dilemmas of forbidden love. This is the Hutzul version of Romeo and Juliet and whatnot. So it's really very, very interesting what Parajanov does. He also does something that was literally impossible to do then. I don't know what he did to the censors, but he insisted on shadows being only in Ukrainian without being dubbed into Russian. The Russification of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors was affected by American distributors when they wrote on the box of the VHS cassette that this is a story taking place in, quote, medieval Russia, and then ascribing all the Russian Ivanushka, Alyonushka, all Russified names in the subtitles to the film. So Vasil becomes Vasily, Pavlo becomes Pavel, and on and on and on. So what even Soviet censors were not able to do, US distributors did it, strangely enough. As to whether it is possible to be a Ukrainian, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, I don't think the comparison of Ukraine with Ireland is very can be very illuminating. I always hear that comparison as a justification to bring in Russian imperialism back into Ukrainian fold and justify and normalize its toxic presence, because as the situation where Ukrainian and Russian language and culture have a parity, where Russian does not seek to dominate Ukrainian, to me is problematic to imagine. Maybe my imagination is limited, but historically speaking, there's always, it always comes to Ukrainian being reduced, diminished, and ousted from its ancestral territory, and Russian seeking hegemony and domination. So to speak as a transitional state, as a transition from colonized state to free state, decolonized state, I can very well see such a transitional identity as Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but only as a transitional identity. And I feel that a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians today realize, with the help of Putin and Russians, the untenability of such a position, that this position is ethically untenable, that this position ends up justifying the brutalities of Russian imperialism. Now that, you know, it was openly said that Ukraine as a word should not exist, Ukrainian as a culture should not exist, and 2 million of Ukrainians should be killed and the rest re-educated. So this kind of, again, to me, this kind of proposition in the time of war is highly problematic. And I would be suspicious of it being a strategy of kind of making the presence of Russian imperial influence permanent.
I was thinking about Muratova. I mean, obviously, I do agree with you about now, and that's why lots of Russophone Ukrainians are now renouncing the Russian language. But before, Putin's interventions.
Yes.
You could surely, and she's a good example. Her allegiances were not with Soviet Russia. I mean, she had a terrible time from Soviet Russia. She's not even Russian. I mean, so I just feel she needs some defense here. And culturally, she's not. I mean, again, you were talking about the avant-garde Ukrainian directors, with whom lots of people draw parallels in her work.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to find a way in which kind of culture could balance ethnicity. Otherwise, if you're born Russian speaking, you seem to be doomed in this scenario, never to be really able to be properly Ukrainian unless you kind of,
I think, yeah, I don't think Russian culture has a future in Ukraine.
No, I agree about that.
Just because Russian culture has a long history of assimilating to it all non-Russian cultures. I don't think Kira Muratova, she was a dissident all her life, and she was a dissident in the Soviet times, but in a deep sense, she was also a Russian imperialist, because it took somebody, some willful thinking not to notice the nation you are living in the midst of in Odessa all your life and pretend it doesn't exist. Particularly when you know other Ukrainian dissidents, and there is a sense of solidarity with the Ukrainian people, when you know what was done to Ukrainian people, the Holodomor and the consistent destruction of culture, of language, and not to show solidarity with them in some small way, to me is really very peculiar. I don't think, being Ukrainian does not mean to be narrow-mindedly ethnical. Ukrainian can be cosmopolitan. You can speak Ukrainian and be a cosmopolitan and be conversant with global culture and express general human values and preoccupations and whatnot. Being Ukrainian opens the world to a person, because being Ukrainian means also being free. Being Russian shuts the world down, limits, puts the blinkers on your world, and every time you see something, you ask yourself, а как же Россия? А где же Россия? А мы лучше? А мы красивее? That's the kind of a knee-jerk reaction that you find in that imperial mentality. And I'm not saying that all Russians think like imperialists, no.
Because you seemed to be sort of reversing the argument there, and it's very important to remind ourselves how many Russians are fighting this.
Right.
Including filmmakers are actually fighting this imperialist, passéist mentality that is so dangerous and so disastrous and brutal. So,
but for instance, if you go back,
and just to add a phrase to that, I think that, and that's why I was asking also about the cinematic input that Muratova makes. Do you not think that Muratova deconstructs language in itself in a much broader and bigger way than talking about Russian, Ukrainian, about national languages? I think she deconstructs language as a construct.
She might, but I like to look at her from the point of view of a political scientist and a rank and file or grassroots or common viewer. The viewer that comes away after watching her films, and what would he think? For instance, if the only Ukrainian you hear in Muratova's film is in one case when a criminally insane person delivers a kind of a rant, all in impeccable literary Ukrainian, what kind of association that creates in my mind as a viewer? In another case, she mocks Ukrainian by Traktor v poli dir dir dir, my za pracю, something like that, completely in Chekhov's stories. And in still another instance, a homeless woman who is also played in the street grind, her film called something about Sharmanka, Melody для Sharmanki, something like that, where Nina Ruslanova again speaks Ukrainian, and the character is anything but very attractive. So that's the kind of repertoire of Ukrainian language that she offers to the viewer. And a Ukrainian comes away from that insulted, diminished, and humiliated. That is what important to me for when I analyze her impact on a mass viewer. And also people who, she has an incredible influence on a new generation of viewers, of filmmakers like Eva Neyman, like Alexander Shapiro, by their own admission, who as well, Eva Neyman here in her Uriki, again presents the same place called Berdichev as absolutely Russian. And we are talking about 2008 or 9. Shapiro, in Shapiro's films, you won't find Ukrainian anywhere. And his films are all in Kyiv located. So this is the Muratova that preoccupies me in the kind of practical, political sense of analysis.
Okay, thanks very much. That is definitely the kind of discussion and conversation that we're likely to see continue. I'm quite sure. We do have a couple of other questions at the moment. One is in the chat by Tohrul Abbasov. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Tohrul, you're still with us. Do you want to ask this question yourself?
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask, as you know, there was a general colonization politics in Soviets in 20s and 30s. So was there such a politic in Soviet Ukrainian also? I know the other locations there was such a politics. So if there was or not, what was the impact of this politics in Soviet Ukrainian cinema in 20s, 30s, such as educating new staff, local staff, I mean, filmmakers, or creating local cinematic institutions, theaters, etc.
Thank you for your question, and this is an important issue in the wider context of early Ukrainian film. The indigenization policy, kolonizatsiya, was proclaimed as a new Communist Party course or direction or policies in 1923. And it was not done because of the goodness of the heart of Moscow. Moscow felt acutely that they had no social basis, that Moscow Bolshevism did not have wide enough support in Ukraine. And they felt very shaky in Ukraine. So these policies were designed to win the sympathies and support of Ukrainians for the new regime, but also to kind of cleverly provoke people who were in hiding to declare their positions and their kind of value orientations so that they be known. And these policies were in place for some 6 years, a very brief period of time, that provoked an incredible eruption of cultural creativity of Ukrainians in literature, in arts, in sculpture, in architecture, and most importantly in film. 6 short years. They started being done away with in 1929. The trial of the Union of Liberation of Ukraine marked the beginning of the first blow to the head of the Ukrainian nation, the destruction of cultural elites. And these policies succeeded in creating what in Ukrainian historiography is called the executed Renaissance. In Ukrainian, it sounds розстріляне відродження. So some 75–80% of all Ukrainian intelligentsia publishing anything, whether literature, whether science, whether anything, ended up being physically killed, destroyed. So that's that, and the same Mykola Kulish, the playwright who was killed, in the same play Mina Mazailo says, one of his characters says, with kind of blood-curdling propheticism, isn't this policy designed to reveal all Ukrainians so that they later can be killed? That is one of the lines of one of the characters in that play. And it was prophetic. The play was only 3 or 4 years away from the actual mass killing of Ukrainians organized by the Soviet regime.
Thank you.
Sorry, I muted myself. We have one question from Olga Kim. I think we're probably going to, I'm probably going to call this the last question because Yuri has been answering our questions at great length and he's probably exhausted. So Olga, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuri, for your talk. I kind of want to follow up to the previous questions. And to Parajanov, we can also add Ilyenko, Asika's films from the 60s, art house cinema that would be, I assume you would exclude from this depopulation narrative. And my question was, and then to look at most of the examples, like Pyryev, it's a popular cinema, commercial, or the later post-Soviet films, it's a more commercial concerns that they produce films that would appeal to a broader audiences. So my question is, to what extent the division between popular commercial cinema versus high art house cinema sits with your argument on cinematic depopulation and cultural imperialism? It seems that the cases that works well with cultural imperialism and cinematic depopulation are mostly commercial films, whereas art house films do not easily sit. Ukrainian art house films, for example, like Ilyenko or Asika or Parajanov, to that extent, is hard to consider within that narrative.
Okay, that's a very, very interesting turn of the perspective and very intriguing too. Thank you so much. Well, number one, I disagree that it sits well with one and ill with another, because Kira Muratova is a highbrow art house film. I can't imagine her films as being commercially kind of oriented, and she is a wonderful practitioner of that mode. Speaking about Ilyenko and Oseka, you can look at them as, in a way, a variety of a depopulation, in this sense that their films never take place in the urban space, in urban spaces. They're always either in the past, in historical past, like Oseka's the Kamienny Khrest, the cross of stone or stone cross, which was safe, and the Soviets liked Ukrainians to keep Ukrainians in the museum that way. You could make films in Ukraine in the past. There was no threat, but also like the Ilyenko's films, the Well for the Thirsty, that's a village, even though they come from the city into the village. It's on the board, but we also very well know that this film was immediately banned, which is another, I can say that this is an interesting kind of argument in favor of my argument that you were not allowed to present Ukrainians acting and living in urban spaces. Ukrainians were not allowed to come from cities. They were allowed to be villagers, yokels, ethnographic, and so on. So in that sense, I think to fine-tune my argument, the body of work of Ilyenko's can be regarded under the angle of depopulation as a kind of a prescription, the taboo on films, Ukrainian films, taking place in the urban space. Where you take any of Ilyenko films, they are either historical or they are in the village, and those who feature urban characters are shelved. They are not. They are forbidden, as is the case with Well for the Thirsty. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, and I didn't mean the Muratova is a commercial success film, but rather it goes against not only Ukrainian, but probably human being in general. So it's hard to claim human nature to look at her films from cultural imperialism, but rather in a broader sense, but it was brought up already. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for all those questions. They were all very, very interesting questions. And thank you, Yuri, for answering them so elaborately and so precisely and in detail. And thank you very much for a really thought-provoking talk. I'm sure that the other events that we're going to be organizing as part of this, this series over the next 12 months and beyond will be equally thought-provoking. But they certainly give us much food for thought. The key question in my mind, which is not one I'm asking you to answer right now, is what on earth do we do with all the films we teach? How do we deal with this absence? It's extremely difficult to teach in absence unless we completely reconfigure our syllabuses, and perhaps that's what we are going to have to do. But anyway, I'd like to thank you once again. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us this evening, and also to encourage you to attend our next event on the 30th of May. So hopefully Rachel and I will see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best to you.